A billionaire publicly humiliates his black maid, only to later realize that she is the estranged daughter he abandoned, creating a profound moment of reckoning for him. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The Grand Ballroom at the Plaza Hotel sparkled under crystal chandeliers as New York's elite gathered for what promised to be the social event of the season. Thomas Reid, dressed in a perfectly tailored Tom Ford tuxedo, stood at the entrance, greeting each guest with practiced charm. His 6'2" frame commanded attention, and his silver hair and sharp features gave him the distinguished look of old money, though he'd built his real estate empire from scratch. The ballroom buzzed with conversation as waiters weaved through the crowd carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Among them was Kiera, her black uniform pristine, her movements precise as she navigated the space. At 23, she carried herself with quiet dignity, though her shoulders tensed whenever she passed too close to the VIP section where Thomas held court. "Another remarkable event, Thomas," said Senator Williams, raising his glass. "Your foundation's work in urban development is unprecedented." Thomas smiled, revealing perfect white teeth. "When you have the means, giving back isn't just an option, it's an obligation." He paused to check his reflection in a nearby mirror, adjusting his already impeccable bow tie. The gesture wasn't lost on the young socialites who watched his every move, hoping to catch his attention. Kiera approached their group, carrying a tray of specialty cocktails. Her hands were steady, but her heart raced as she offered drinks to Thomas's inner circle. As she extended the tray toward Thomas, a guest suddenly backed into her. The tray tilted slightly, and a single drop of red wine splashed onto Thomas's sleeve. The room didn't fall silent, it imploded. Thomas's face transformed from polished charm to cold fury in an instant. "Are you completely incompetent?" His voice cut through the ambient chatter like a blade. "Do you have any idea what this suit costs?" Kiera's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry, sir. I can help." "Help? You've done enough." Thomas's voice rose, drawing more attention. "This is exactly what happens when we lower our hiring standards. Some people simply don't belong in these environments." The other guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. A few even nodded in agreement, eager to align themselves with Thomas's position. Kiera stood frozen, her face burning with humiliation as tears threatened to spill from her eyes. "I suggest you remove yourself from my sight," Thomas continued, his tone dripping with disdain. "And don't expect to work another event of this caliber again." Kiera backed away, her vision blurring. She made it to the service corridor before the first tear fell, then hurried to the staff room where she collapsed into a metal folding chair, her hands shaking as she covered her face. Back in the ballroom, Thomas had already moved on. He accepted a fresh drink from another server and resumed his conversation as if nothing had happened. "As I was saying, Senator, our latest development project will transform the entire neighborhood." His voice carried the same warm authority it had moments before, the incident with Kiera apparently forgotten. The evening continued its predictable course. Thomas worked the room with expertise, securing promises for donations and support for his various ventures. He posed for photos, laughed at the right moments, and maintained his position at the center of attention. If anyone noticed the slight stain on his sleeve, they didn't mention it. As midnight approached, Thomas stood at the podium to deliver his closing remarks. "Your generosity tonight will change lives," he declared, raising his glass. "Together, we're building a better New York." The crowd applauded enthusiastically, and Thomas basked in their approval, completely unaware that he had just publicly humiliated his own daughter. The evening's success was measured in donation pledges and social media mentions. Thomas's outburst would be forgotten by most guests before they reached their cars, filed away as just another example of a powerful man exercising his authority. But for Kiera, alone in the staff room with her tears dried and her uniform still perfect, the night marked the beginning of a story that would shake the foundations of Thomas Reid's carefully constructed world. Victoria Reid waited in the master bedroom of their Upper East Side penthouse, her silk robe wrapped tightly around her as she heard Thomas's key in the door. The city lights sparkled through floor-to-ceiling windows, but the atmosphere inside was heavy with tension. She watched her husband loosen his bow tie, his movements precise even after midnight. "I heard about what happened at the event," Victoria said, her voice carefully measured. "That poor girl, Thomas. Was it really necessary?" Thomas shrugged off his jacket, examining the now-dried wine stain with distaste. "Standards must be maintained. These events reflect directly on our reputation." "Your reputation," Victoria corrected, standing up. "You're becoming more isolated every day. The board members whisper about it. Your friends notice it. When was the last time you had dinner with the Hendersons? Or took a weekend off?" "I built this empire from nothing," Thomas snapped, his facade cracking slightly. "I didn't get here by coddling incompetent staff or taking weekends off." Victoria approached him, her expression softening. "You got here by being brilliant, yes. But you used to be kind, too. Remember when we first met? You would help the maintenance staff carry their equipment. You knew everyone's names. That was different. I was different." Thomas turned away, facing the window. The city spread before him like a kingdom, but his reflection showed a man increasingly alone in his tower. "The world is changing, Thomas. You can't keep treating people like they're beneath you. One day, it will cost you everything." He waved off her concern, heading to the bar cart to pour himself a scotch. "Save the lectures for your charity board meetings, Victoria. I know exactly what I'm doing." Across town, in a small walk-up apartment in Queens, Kiera sat cross-legged on her bed, a worn shoebox open before her. Inside lay the fragments of a past she'd pieced together over years. A faded photograph of her mother, young and beautiful, standing outside a diner in Manhattan. Newspaper clippings about Thomas Reed's rise in real estate, and a letter her mother had written but never sent. Kiera traced her finger over her mother's handwriting. "My dearest Thomas," it began, "there's something you need to know." The rest of the letter revealed a secret her mother had taken to her grave, or so Kiera had always believed. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Kiera, you okay in there?" Her roommate's voice was thick with concern. "I'm fine, Rachel," she called back, quickly wiping her eyes. "Just tired from work." But she wasn't fine. The humiliation from earlier still burned, made worse by the fact that Thomas Reed was exactly the kind of man she'd always imagined her father to be. Wealthy, powerful, and completely indifferent to people like her. Meanwhile, in his study at the Reed mansion, Thomas received an unexpected late-night visitor. James Morrison, his oldest friend and legal counsel, arrived looking troubled. "This couldn't wait until morning?" Thomas asked, irritated by the interruption. James placed a file on the desk between them. "No, it couldn't. That girl from tonight's event, I recognized her. I've been going through some old records, and, Thomas, you need to see this." Thomas opened the file reluctantly, his expression changing as he read. "Color Dre." Ned from his face. "This can't be right," he whispered. "DNA test results don't lie," James said quietly. "Neither does the timing. Remember Maria Alvarez? The waitress you dated during your first development project?" Thomas's hands began to shake. "Maria died. Years ago." "Yes, she did, but not before giving birth to your daughter." James leaned forward. "The girl you humiliated tonight? That was Kiera Alvarez. Your daughter." The scotch glass slipped from Thomas's hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the quiet house like a gunshot. "I had our team verify everything," James continued, watching his friend carefully. "There's no doubt, Thomas. The girl you publicly dressed down tonight is your flesh and blood." Thomas staggered to his chair, his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. Images flashed through his mind. Maria's smile, their brief but intense relationship, the news of her death that had arrived years later. And now this. A daughter he never knew existed, working as a server at his events, bearing the brunt of his arrogance. "Does she know?" he managed to ask. "About you being her father?" "No, not yet. But after tonight's scene, it's only a matter of time before someone makes the connection." Thomas pressed his fingers to his temples, his empire suddenly feeling meaningless in the face of this revelation. The weight of his actions, not just from tonight, but from years of cultivating his untouchable image, crashed down around him. Victoria appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of breaking glass. She took in the scene, Her husband's ashen face, James's grim expression, and the scattered papers on the desk. "Thomas," she questioned softly, "what's happened?" But Thomas couldn't answer. For the first time in decades, the man who always had something to say sat in complete silence, confronting the consequences of a past he thought he'd left behind. Thomas sat alone in his home office as dawn broke over Manhattan, surrounded by old photographs and documents he'd pulled from his personal safe. His normally pristine desk was cluttered with memories he'd tried to forget. Candid photos of him and Maria outside the diner where they'd met, her waitress uniform wrinkled after a long shift, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. "I should have looked for you," he whispered to Maria's image. The truth was, he had been relieved when she disappeared. It had been easier to focus on his ambitions without complications from his past. Now, that past had returned with devastating clarity. He found himself remembering specific moments. Maria telling him her dreams of opening her own restaurant, her determination to put herself through culinary school, the way she'd roll her eyes at his grand plans for building his empire. She had seen through his facade, recognized the wounded man beneath the ambition. The news of her death had reached him through a brief obituary 7 years ago. He'd sent flowers anonymously, but never investigated further, never questioned whether she'd left anything or anyone behind. His cowardice now felt like a physical weight on his chest. Victoria found him there hours later, still staring at the photographs. "You loved her," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I thought I did," Thomas replied. "But real love requires courage. I chose ambition instead." Across the city, in a community center in Queens, Kiera sat in a circle with 11 other people, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The sign on the door read, "Breaking Barriers, Support Group for Workplace Discrimination." "My name is Kiera," she began, her voice shaky but growing stronger. "And last night, I was humiliated by one of the most powerful men in New York." The words tumbled out as she described the incident, the familiar taste of shame mixing with new anger. "He didn't just attack my competence," she continued. "He attacked my right to be in that space at all. Like people like me should know our place and stay there." Marcus Williams, the group facilitator and a former security guard who'd faced similar discrimination, leaned forward in his chair. At 35, his presence commanded respect without intimidation, a skill learned through years of navigating hostile environments. "What you're feeling isn't just personal pain," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying years of hard-won wisdom. "It's the weight of a system designed to make us feel small. But here's the thing, recognizing that pain, naming it out loud, that's the first step toward changing it." Other group members shared similar stories. Doors closed because of their accent, promotions denied despite qualifications, subtle and not-so-subtle messages that they didn't belong. With each story, Kiera felt something shift inside her, her shame transforming into determination. After the session, Marcus approached her. "Your story hit home for a lot of people here," he said, handing her a business card. "We're organizing a series of speaking events, sharing experiences like yours. Would you be interested in participating?" Kiera studied the card. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "Nobody's ever ready," Marcus smiled. "But sometimes our stories are bigger than our fear." "What happened to you?" "That's not just about one bad night or one arrogant billionaire. It's about patterns that need to be exposed and changed." As they talked, Kiera found herself opening up about her search for identity, her unknown father, the struggles of her single mother. Marcus listened without judgment, occasionally offering insights from his own journey. "You know what I learned doing security in those fancy buildings?" he said. "Those people at the top? They're not special. They're just people who never had their right to be there questioned. Maybe it's time we started questioning that." The conversation continued over coffee at a nearby diner. Coincidentally, the same one where her mother had once worked, though Kiera didn't know it. As she described her mother's strength in raising her alone, Marcus shared his own experiences of mentoring young people facing similar challenges. "Your mother sounds like she was an amazing woman," Marcus observed. "She was," Kiera agreed, then corrected herself. "She is. Sometimes I feel like I'm letting her down, like I should be doing more with my life than serving drinks to rich people." "Maybe this is exactly where you need to be," Marcus suggested. Sometimes life puts us in places that seem wrong, but they're actually stepping stones to something bigger. As the afternoon light faded, Kiera felt a new sense of purpose emerging from the ashes of her humiliation. She agreed to speak at the next community event, recognizing that her story might help others find their voice. Meanwhile, Thomas had moved from his office to the diner, where he'd first met Maria. He sat in what used to be his regular booth, now worn and reupholstered in a different color. The coffee tasted the same, but everything else had changed. He watched the current waitstaff hustle between tables, wondering if any of them had dreams like Maria's, if any of them had children whose lives he might be unknowingly impacting through his actions and decisions. For the first time in years, Thomas Reed felt the full weight of his choices, not just the dramatic ones, but the daily small cruelties he justified as necessary for success. As he left the diner, he didn't notice the flyer for the upcoming community speaking event posted on the bulletin board, where both his and his daughter's paths would soon intersect again. Thomas's town car idled outside Kiera's former high school in Queens. From the back seat, he watched students stream through the gates, their uniforms a sea of navy and gray. His driver shifted uncomfortably and used to spending so much time in this neighborhood. She graduated with honors. The principal had told him earlier, after D made a substantial donation to facilitate his questions. Scholarship offers from several colleges, but she couldn't accept them. Family circumstances, you understand. Those family circumstances now weighed heavily on Thomas. He learned that after Maria's death, Kiera had worked part-time throughout high school to support herself. The same drive he prided himself on having, she demonstrated while still a teenager. His next stop was the community college where Kiera took night classes. The registrar's office revealed her current course load: business administration and hospitality management. She was paying her way through school by working multiple jobs, including the catering position at his events. She never misses a class, her professor shared when Thomas introduced himself as a potential employer checking references. Always prepared, always asking questions about real-world applications. She's got plans, that one. Each new piece of information felt like an indictment. While he'd been building towers and expanding his empire, his daughter had been fighting for every opportunity, every scrap of education, every step forward. Across town, Kiera sat in the public library, scrolling through archived news articles about Thomas Reed. The more she read, the more her hands trembled. Real estate mogul Thomas Reed announces new development project. Reed Properties faces controversy over historic building demolition. Thomas Reed's rise. From working class to billionaire, the last article caught her attention. It mentioned his early days, working as a busboy while taking night classes. He'd met his first investors while serving them coffee, not unlike how her mother had met him, though the article didn't mention that part. A photograph from 25 years ago showed him outside a diner. Kiera's breath caught. She recognized that diner. It was the same one from her mother's old photo. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was her mother's smiling face. "No," Kiera whispered, pieces clicking into place. She pulled out her mother's photo, comparing them side by side. The dates matched. The location matched. But surely it couldn't be. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Found something interesting. Meet me at the center." At the community center, Marcus had his own laptop open. "I did some digging after our talk," he said. "Look at this." He pulled up an old building permit application. "The diner where your mom worked? Guess who bought it and renovated it back in '99? Thomas Reed," Kiera said numbly. "Yeah, but here's the weird part. The renovation plans changed suddenly, preserved the original layout instead of demolishing it like his other projects. The only time Reed Properties ever did that." Kiera's mind raced. She'd always wondered why her mother kept that unsent letter, why she'd sometimes catch her staring at real estate news with a strange expression. Now, looking at the pieces laid out before her, a terrible suspicion took root. "There's more," Marcus said gently. "I found this in the city records." He slid over a birth certificate. Kiera's birth certificate. Where her father's name should have been, there was only a blank space, but the date of birth and her mother's address at the time told a story she wasn't ready to face. Back in his office, Thomas stared at a similar document, his copy obtained through more official channels. The DNA test results James had shown him lay beside it, along with a timeline his investigators had assembled. His phone lit up with a text from Victoria. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Thomas typed back. "I found everything except forgiveness." He looked out his window at the city he'd helped shape. Somewhere out there, Kiera was probably serving drinks at another event, carrying the weight of his ignorance and arrogance without even knowing it. Or perhaps she knew now. Perhaps she'd always known, and that's why she'd taken the job at his events. His computer chimed with a news alert. Community Center announces speaker series, Voices from the Margins. The accompanying photo showed a group of people outside the center. In the background, partially obscured but unmistakable, was Kiera, standing next to a tall man who seemed to be organizing the event. Thomas reached for his phone again, then stopped. Why did he have to contact her? What could he possibly say to justify 23 years of absence, culminating in public humiliation? As night fell over the city, father and daughter sat in their respective spaces, each watching the same sunset through different windows, each holding pieces of a shared history they were only beginning to understand. The truth hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, but neither knew how to take the first step. The documents on Thomas's desk and the articles on Kiera's laptop told the same story from different angles. A story of ambition, loss, and the invisible threads that connect past to present. Tomorrow, they would have to decide what to do with these truths. Tonight, they sat with their discoveries, letting the weight of them settle into their bones. The community center's main hall buzzed with anticipation. Every folding chair was filled, with people standing along the walls. Marcus had advertised the event as Voices of Change, stories from the service industry, but the crowd exceeded everyone's expectations. Kiera paced backstage, her prepared speech crumpling slightly in her sweating hands. Through the curtain, she could hear Marcus introducing the evening's theme. "Our stories matter," Marcus was saying. "They're not just personal experiences. They're evidence of systemic issues that need addressing. And tonight, we have someone brave enough to share her story." In the back of the hall, unnoticed by anyone, Thomas Reed slipped in wearing jeans and a dark sweater instead of his usual tailored suit. He'd received an anonymous email with a link to the event's live stream, but something had compelled him to attend in person. Victoria's words about his isolation echoed in his mind. Kiera stepped onto the small stage, the spotlight catching the determination in her eyes. She smoothed her speech, then set it aside. "I had something prepared," she began, her voice shaky but clear. "But I think I need to speak from the heart instead." The audience leaned forward collectively, sensing the authenticity in her voice. "A week ago, I was humiliated by someone powerful," she continued. "Someone who looked at me and saw nothing but a servant who'd stepped out of line. But that moment taught me something important. It showed me exactly who I don't want to become." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the words hitting him like physical blows. "My mother," Kiera's voice strengthened, "worked in the service industry her whole life. She taught me that true dignity isn't about what you own or how much power you have. It's about how you treat others. She died believing that everyone deserves respect, no matter their position." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Marcus, standing at the side of the stage, nodded encouragingly. "But here's what I've learned since that night," Kiera continued. "Sometimes humiliation can become fuel. Sometimes being pushed down gives you the perfect position to stand up stronger." She described her journey, the late nights studying, the multiple jobs, the dreams she refused to abandon. Without naming Thomas, she painted a vivid picture of the charity event, drawing knowing nods from other service workers in the audience. "We're not invisible," her voice rang out. "We're not beneath anyone. We're the backbone of this city. We serve your food, clean your offices, take care of your children. We deserve to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with basic human dignity." Thomas watched as the audience began to stand, one by one, many wiping tears from their eyes. He remained seated, feeling the weight of every word. "I'm starting a program," Kiera announced, gaining confidence from the response. "Free evening classes for service workers who want to advance their careers. Because sometimes all people need is a chance, the same chance that others take for granted. Marcus stepped forward with sign-up sheets, but people were already lining up. The energy in the room had transformed from sympathy to action. My mother used to say that change happens one person at a time, Kiera concluded. Tonight, I'm asking each of you to be that change. Stand up, speak out, support each other. Because dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right. The applause was thunderous. People surged forward to shake her hand, share their stories, sign up for her program. Thomas watched from his corner as his daughter, this stranger he'd wronged, transformed from a victim into a leader before his eyes. Later that evening, alone in his study, Thomas watched the recorded live stream again and again. Each viewing revealed new details. The set of Kiera's jaw, so like his own. Her gesture of pushing back her hair, exactly as Maria used to do. The way she commanded attention without demanding it. A skill he'd spent years cultivating, but she seemed to possess naturally. He opened his laptop and began searching for information about service industry education programs. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he considered his next move. Any direct involvement from him might taint Kiera's achievement, make it seem like charitable patronage rather than the triumph of her own determination. His phone buzzed with a message from James, saw the live stream. What are you going to do? Thomas stared at the message for a long time. Finally, he typed, For once in my life, I'm going to listen instead of speak. He pulled up the video one more time, watching as his daughter stood tall under the spotlight, her voice clear and strong. In her face, he saw both his ambition and Maria's compassion, combined into something entirely new, something better than either of them had been. The revelation broke him open in ways that all his wealth and power never could. His daughter wasn't just surviving in the world he'd helped create. She was working to transform it. And for the first time in his life, Thomas Reed found himself wanting to follow someone else's lead. The success of Kiera's speech led to weekly meetings at a small coffee shop near the community center. Marcus arrived early one morning to find her already there, surrounded by papers and nursing her second cup of coffee. You know, he said, sliding into the booth across from her, when I suggested sharing your story, I didn't expect you to start a movement. Kiera looked up from her notes, dark circles under her eyes betraying her exhaustion. 37 people signed up for the first round of classes, she said, pushing a spreadsheet toward him. I've got volunteers ready to teach business basics, computer skills, and ESL. But we need space, supplies. Marcus pulled out his laptop. I've got good news on that front. Remember my friend who works at the public library? They're willing to let us use their computer lab after hours. Marcus, Kiera's voice wavered. Why are you helping me with all this? He paused, considering his words carefully. Because 10 years ago, I was a security guard watching people like Thomas Reed walk past me like I was part of the furniture. Now I run my own security consulting firm. Someone believed in me, gave me a chance. I'm just passing it forward. Their conversation was interrupted by Kiera's phone buzzing. She glanced at it, then froze. It's from Reed Properties. Marcus leaned forward. What does it say? With shaking hands, Kiera read the email. Dear Ms. Alvarez, on behalf of Thomas Reed, I would like to arrange a meeting to discuss your recent community initiative. Mr. Reed has expressed personal interest in your program. Please advise if you would be willing to meet. Are you going to respond? Marcus asked quietly. Kiera set the phone down like it might bite her. Why now? After everything. Why does he suddenly care? Maybe your speech affected him more than you know, Marcus suggested. The live stream had over 10,000 views. Or maybe he's trying to save face after the video went viral. Kiera's voice hardened. Buy some good PR with a charitable donation. Marcus studied her face. You know, there's something you haven't told me about all this. Something more than just that night at the charity event. Kiera stared at her coffee, debating whether to share her discovery. Finally, she pulled out the birth certificate and photos she'd found. I think Thomas Reed is my father. Marcus took in the documents silently, pieces clicking into place. Does he know? I don't know. Maybe that's why he wants to meet. She laughed bitterly. Imagine finding out your father is the man who publicly humiliated you. Across town, Thomas paced his office, checking his email every few minutes. James watched from the doorway. She might not respond right away, James said. Or at all. I know. Thomas stopped pacing. I had my assistant send it. Ay macawerd, arente y. You're trying, James corrected. That's more than you were doing a month ago. Thomas walked to his window wall, looking out over the city. I watched her speech again last night. She has Maria's passion, her sense of justice. But her drive, her strategic thinking. He trailed off. She gets that from you, James finished. The best parts of you. The parts you've forgotten. Thomas's phone chimed. Both men turned to look at it. The response was brief. Mr. Reed, I appreciate your interest in our initiative. However, I believe any meeting between us would be inappropriate given our previous interaction. The community we serve needs sustainable support, not charitable gestures. Kiera Alvarez, well, James said after a moment, she definitely has your talent for professional rejection. Thomas sat heavily in his chair. She's right. A meeting would look like damage control. He pulled up his browser, navigating to the community center's donation page. Maybe there's another way. Back at the coffee shop, Marcus watched Kiera struggle with her decision. You know, he said carefully, sometimes the hardest person to forgive is the one we're supposed to love automatically. I don't love him, Kiera snapped. I don't even know him. Maybe that's the point, Marcus suggested. Maybe it's time you did. Kiera's phone buzzed again. A notification from the community center's fundraising platform. An anonymous donation of $250,000 had just been made to their education initiative. It's him, she whispered. Marcus leaned back, thoughtful. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Kiera stared at the notification, emotions warring on her face. Finally, she began typing. Dear Mr. Reed, while we appreciate the generous donation, I believe we have matters to discuss beyond our community initiative. I agree to meet on one condition. We meet as equals, not as a billionaire and a server. There's something you need to know. Kiera, her finger hovered over the send button as Marcus waited patiently. Around them, the coffee shop buzzed with morning activity, people rushing to their jobs, their lives intersecting briefly before moving on. Just like her mother and Thomas all those years ago. Whatever you decide, Marcus said softly, I've got your back. Kiera pressed send, then immediately closed her email. I need to prepare for this, she said, gathering her papers. I need to be ready. Marcus helped her pack up, understanding that this was about more than just a meeting. It was about confronting the past, about bridging the gap between two worlds, about finding closure, or perhaps something more. As they left the coffee shop, neither noticed Victoria Reed sitting in a corner, having witnessed the entire scene. She pulled out her phone and dialed her husband's number. Thomas, she said when he answered, I think it's time we talked about Maria's daughter. And this time, you need to listen. The restaurant Thomas had chosen for their meeting was neither flashy nor humble, a neutral ground in Midtown Manhattan. He arrived 15 minutes early, dismissing his driver and walking the last few blocks to clear his head. Victoria's words from their conversation echoed in his mind. Don't try to fix this with money. Just listen. He selected a table in the back, away from windows and curious eyes. His usual power suit had been replaced by a simple button-down shirt and slacks, an intentional choice to honor Kiera's condition about meeting as equals. Kiera arrived precisely on time, Marcus having dropped her off around the corner. You've got this, he'd said. Remember, you're not that scared server anymore. She squared her shoulders and walked in, spotting Thomas immediately. Ms. Alvarez, Thomas stood, extending his hand. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Mr. Reed. Her handshake was firm, professional. She took her seat, placing a manila envelope on the table between them. The waiter approached, but Kiera waved him off. I'm not here for lunch, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I'm here for truth. Thomas nodded, pushing away his untouched water glass. Before we begin, I want to apologize for my behavior at the charity event. It was inexcusable. Which part? Kiera's voice carried an edge. The public humiliation, or not recognizing your own daughter? The words hung in the air like shattered glass. Thomas's carefully prepared speech died in his throat. How long have you known? She asked. Since the night of the event. My lawyer recognized you. Thomas forced himself to maintain eye contact. How did you? Kiera opened the envelope, laying out the photographs and documents one by one. Mom kept everything. The pictures, the letters she never sent, the birth certificate. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained firm. She loved you, you know, even after you chose your empire over her. I didn't know she was pregnant, Thomas said quietly. If I had, what? You would have done the right thing? Kiera's laugh was bitter. Like you did at the charity event. I deserve that, Thomas acknowledged. I've made countless mistakes, but that night, seeing you stand up at the community center, watching you turn pain into purpose, it showed me exactly who I've become. And who you've become despite me, not because of me. I don't need your approval, Kiera said sharply. Or your money. I built something real at that community center. Something that actually helps people. I know. Thomas leaned forward. That's why I wanted to meet. Not to throw money at a problem, but to understand. To listen. To what? Stories about mom working double shifts to put me through school? About the scholarships I couldn't accept because someone had to pay rent? Each word carried years of suppressed anger. Or maybe you'd like to hear about how I discovered my father was the same man who treated me like I was nothing? Thomas absorbed each blow, knowing he deserved them all. Tell me everything, he said softly. I want to know all of it. For a moment, Kiera was thrown by his sincerity. She'd prepared for defensiveness, for excuses, for attempts to buy her silence. This quiet acceptance was unexpected. Mom never told you because she knew you were building something important, Kiera continued, her voice softening slightly. She didn't want to be the one to derail your dreams. Even when she got sick, she made me promise not to contact you. Maria always put others first, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. She was the best person I ever knew, and I was too blind to see it. So, he died believing you'd become the man she always thought you could be. Kiera pulled out one final document, her mother's last letter, never sent. She wrote this from the hospital. I found it after she was gone. Thomas took the letter with trembling hands, recognizing Maria's handwriting. My dearest Thomas, by the time you read this, if you ever do, I'll be gone. Our daughter is everything we could have hoped for. Strong, determined, compassionate. She has your drive and my heart. I never told you about her because I saw the greatness in you, the potential to change the world. I hoped one day you'd find that greatness not in building towers, but in lifting people up. If you're reading this, it means Kiera has found her way to you. Please see her, really see her, not as a reminder of your past or an obligation to fulfill, but as the amazing person she's become. And maybe, through her, you can find your way back to the man I once knew, the one who wanted to build not just buildings, but a better world. Forever, Maria. When Thomas looked up, there were tears in his eyes. I don't deserve forgiveness, he said quietly. I'm not offering it, Kiera replied. Not yet. But maybe we can build something new. Something honest. Thomas nodded, understanding the gift she was offering. Not absolution, but possibility. I have conditions, she continued. The community center remains mine. No interference, no corporate takeover. And I want to know everything about you and Mom, about those years, about who you were before you became Thomas Reed, the billionaire. All of it, Thomas agreed. No more secrets. As they sat in that quiet corner, father and daughter, facing each other across a table laden with the weight of the past, the city continued its endless rhythm around them. Neither knew what would come next, but for the first time, they were facing it together, their shared history finally acknowledged, their future uncertain, but open with possibility. The Reed Properties boardroom fell silent as Thomas finished speaking. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the shocked faces of his executive team. Let me understand this. Charles Morton, his CFO, leaned forward. You want to redirect 30% of our annual philanthropy budget to grassroots community organizations? And personally oversee the selection process? Not oversee, Thomas corrected, standing at the head of the table. Participate in, as an equal member of the selection committee, alongside community leaders and service industry representatives. Victoria, sitting at the opposite end, couldn't hide her smile. This was the man she'd married, before power and wealth had hardened him. Furthermore, Thomas continued, I'm implementing new policies for all Reed Properties events. Living wage requirements for all service staff, comprehensive benefits, and clear paths for career advancement. The boardroom erupted in murmurs. Thomas raised his hand for silence. I've spent decades building towers that reach the sky, he said quietly. It's time we strengthen the foundation. Across town, Kiera stood before a different audience. The community center's main room was packed with her first class of students, service workers, cleaning staff, and caregivers, all there to begin their journey toward professional advancement. My mother used to say that education isn't just about learning facts, she began. It's about learning your own worth. Marcus, leaning against the back wall, nodded encouragingly. The program they'd built together was already expanding beyond their initial expectations. Each of you has a story, Kiera continued. Each of you has dreams that got put on hold because life demanded survival first. That changes today. She moved through the room, distributing laptops donated by local businesses. Not Reed Properties, she'd been adamant about that. These are yours to keep, your first tools toward building your future. A woman in a hotel, Maid's uniform, raised her hand. Ms. Alvarez, is it true that Thomas Reed is supporting programs like this now? Kiera paused, choosing her words carefully. Mr. Reed is one of many business leaders beginning to recognize the need for change. But this program? This is ours. Built by us, for us. After class, Marcus helped her pack up. You didn't mention he's your father, he observed. That's not relevant to what we're building here, Kiera replied. Though I have to admit, seeing him actually try to change, it's unexpected. Over the next few weeks, both father and daughter found themselves navigating unfamiliar territories. Thomas began showing up at community board meetings, not to speak but to listen. He sat in the back, taking notes, learning about issues he'd never considered despite developing properties in these neighborhoods for years. During one meeting, a resident recognized him. Aren't you Thomas Reed, the developer? Yes, he answered simply. I'm here to learn. The resident looked suspicious. Learn what? How to be a better neighbor. The exchange was recorded on someone's phone and went viral. Thomas Reed, billionaire developer, sitting in a folding chair at a community meeting, just listening. The media tried to spin it as a PR stunt, but those who attended the meetings regularly began to notice a pattern. He kept coming back week after week, rarely speaking, always listening. Meanwhile, Kiera's program was growing. She'd added weekend workshops, bringing in successful professionals from similar backgrounds to share their stories. The waiting list for classes grew longer, and other community centers began reaching out about replicating the model. One evening, as she reviewed applications for the next session, she found a familiar name, Carmen Rodriguez, the server Thomas had hired to replace her at his events. I saw what you said in that speech, Carmen told her during the interview, about dignity not being a privilege. Mr. Reed saw it too. He's different now, asks about our families, knows our names. Some of us are even being trained for management positions. Kiera felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. Change, when real, rippled outward in unexpected ways. That night, she sent Thomas a text, their first direct communication since their meeting. Heard about the new policies at Reed Properties. Mom will be proud. His response came hours later. She'd be prouder of you. Your next class graduation ceremony. Would you mind if I attended? Just to watch, nothing more. Kiera stared at the message for a long time before responding. Back row. No speeches. And bring Victoria. She's been sneaking into my coffee shop meetings with Marcus for weeks thinking I haven't noticed. In his study, Thomas read the message and laughed for the first time in what felt like years. He looked at the photo of Maria he'd placed on his desk, then at the community center newsletter featuring Kiera's latest initiatives. We're trying, he whispered to Maria's image. Both of us in our own ways. The next morning, both father and daughter went to their respective tasks. He to a community board meeting about affordable housing. She to teach a class on professional development. Each carried the weight of their shared past, but now it felt less like a burden and more like a bridge, slowly being rebuilt, one careful step at a time. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel looked different this time. Instead of the usual crystal and champagne elegance, The space was transformed into something more inclusive. Round tables replaced the traditional hierarchy of a main table, and the guest list was a deliberate mix of New York's elite and community leaders. Thomas stood at the entrance, not holding court as he once did, but genuinely welcoming each guest. Victoria watched him with quiet satisfaction, noting how he gave equal attention to the CEO in Tom Ford and the community organizer in her department store Best. Nervous? She asked during a quiet moment. Terrified, Thomas admitted. What if she changes her mind? The event was a bold departure from Reed Properties' usual galas. Titled Building Bridges, a night of community recognition, it was designed to honor grassroots organizations making real change in the city. Kiera's education initiative was one of 5 programs being celebrated. Backstage, Kiera paced, her speech cards trembling slightly in her hands. Marcus adjusted his tie, still uncomfortable in formal wear. You know you don't have to do this, he reminded her. We could accept the grant without the speech. No, Kiera squared her shoulders. It's time. The past 3 months had been a careful dance between father and daughter. Thomas had attended 2 graduation ceremonies, sitting quietly in the back as promised. Kiera had accepted his invitation to tour some of Reed Properties' new community-focused developments. They'd shared 3 careful lunches, each one less awkward than the last, building a fragile bridge over years of absence. But tonight was different. Tonight, they would appear in public together for the first time since that fateful evening that had changed everything. The ballroom slowly filled. Community organizers mingled with business leaders. Service staff, now employees rather than contractors, moved through the crowd with confidence, wearing name tags that identified them as part of the Reed Properties family. Carmen, now events manager, approached Kiera backstage. Everything's ready. And Kiera, thank you. Not just for the program, but for changing him. For changing everything. Thomas took the podium first. Gone was the polished arrogance of previous years. In its place was something more genuine, more human. A year ago, he began, I stood on this stage and thought I understood success. I thought it was measured in square footage and profit margins. I was wrong. The room fell silent. Success isn't about rising above others, he continued. It's about lifting as you climb. Tonight, we honor 5 organizations that exemplify this principle. But before we begin, I have a confession to make. Kiera felt her heart stop. They hadn't discussed this part. The woman who helped me understand this truth, who forced me to confront my own failures, is my daughter. Thomas's voice cracked slightly. A daughter I didn't know I had until she showed me what real strength and dignity look like. A murmur ran through the crowd. Victoria squeezed Marcus's arm, both of them watching Kiera carefully. Kiera Alvarez, Thomas continued, created something remarkable. Not because of me, but in spite of me. And in doing so, she didn't just change her community, she changed me. Tonight, she'll tell you about her initiative herself. But first, he turned, looking directly backstage where he knew she was waiting. First, I want to publicly apologize to her. For years of absence. For that horrible night in this very room. And most of all, for failing to see what her mother always saw. That true legacy isn't built in steel and glass, but in the lives we touch and the changes we inspire. Tears streamed openly down Victoria's face now. Even Marcus looked moved. Kiera, Thomas said softly into the microphone, your mother would be so proud of you. I know I am. The silence in the room was absolute. Every guest, every server, every security guard waited to see what would happen next. Kiera stepped onto the stage, her prepared speech forgotten. The spotlight caught the tears in her eyes, but her voice was strong. A year ago, she began, echoing her father's opening. I stood in this room wearing a different uniform, carrying a different name tag. Tonight, I stand here as myself, Kiera Alvarez Reed. The sound of her chosen name, acknowledging both her mother's heritage and her father's leg. AC caused Thomas to grip the podium for support. My mother taught me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, Kiera continued. It's about choosing to build a different future. Tonight isn't just about celebrating community initiatives. It's about recognizing that real change requires all of us, those with power and those seeking it, those with resources and those with vision. She turned to Thomas, their eyes meeting in a moment of perfect understanding. My father, she said, the word still new on her tongue, taught me that it's never too late to learn, to change, to rebuild. And that's what we're here to celebrate tonight. Not just 5 programs, but the possibility of transformation. As she launched into the details of her initiative, Thomas moved to stand beside her. Not touching, not interrupting, but present, a father supporting his daughter's moment to shine. In the audience, Marcus and Victoria exchanged glances. The air in the ballroom felt charged with possibility, as if something fundamental had shifted in the city's social fabric. But Kiera wasn't finished. As she concluded her speech, she revealed one final surprise that would change everything once again. Still standing at the podium, Kiera reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone. The ballroom remained silent, sensing there was more to come. Thomas stood beside her, as much in the dark about what would follow as everyone else. Before I continue, Kiera said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, I need to make a call. She dialed a number on speakerphone. The rings echoed through the ballroom's sound system. Then a voice, warm, familiar, impossible, answered. Hello, mi amor. Thomas staggered slightly. He knew that voice. Would know it anywhere. Mom, Kiera said, you're on speaker. The whole room can hear you, including him. Maria Alvarez's voice filled the ballroom. Hello, Thomas. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas gripped the podium, his knuckles white. Maria, he whispered. But they told me you died. The obituary. A mistake, Maria explained, her voice carrying years of unspoken words. Different Maria Alvarez. When I saw the announcement, I let people believe it. It seemed easier than explaining why I disappeared. Victoria moved closer to the stage, watching her husband carefully. Marcus stood ready, unsure if he would need to intervene. I've been living in Boston, Maria continued, teaching at a culinary school. Our daughter found me 3 months ago. Kiera turned to face her father. I hired a private investigator after I learned who you were. It took time, but she swallowed hard. Mom never stopped watching your progress, Thomas. She kept every article, every news clipping about your success. All these years, Thomas's voice was rough with emotion. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed to become my own person first, Maria answered. Just like Kiera did. Just like you did. We all had our journeys to make. Thomas looked at his daughter, really looked at her, seeing both Maria's strength and his own determination in her face. When? He asked simply. Mom's flight lands tomorrow morning, Kiera replied. She's ready to meet. If you are. The ballroom erupted in murmurs. This was better than any society drama. The billionaire developer, his long-lost daughter, and now the return of a love he thought he'd lost forever. But Thomas wasn't thinking about the audience anymore. Maria, he said into the phone, I never built anything as beautiful as what you and Kiera built together. Then help us build something new, Maria suggested. All of us, together. Victoria stepped forward, taking Thomas's hand. We'll all help, she said firmly. Family is family. Kiera ended the call and turned to address the room. Tonight wasn't just about recognizing community initiatives. It was about understanding that every story has more chapters than we know. Every person deserves the chance to rewrite their ending. She reached for her father's hand. He took it, their first public gesture of reconciliation. Tomorrow, she continued, we start a new chapter. But tonight, let's celebrate not just what we've built, but what we're going to build together. Marcus started the applause, and it spread through the room like wildfire. Servers, executives, community leaders, all standing, all witnessing this moment of transformation. Thomas pulled his daughter into an embrace, no longer caring about his public image or what anyone might think. Thank you, he whispered, for being braver than I ever was. Later that night, as the event wound down, four people sat at a corner table. Thomas, Kiera, Victoria, and Marcus. They were planning not business deals or property developments, but something more important, how to welcome Maria home. She'll need space, Kiera cautioned. Time to adjust. We've got nothing but time now, Thomas replied, looking years younger despite the evening's emotional toll. Victoria raised her glass. To new beginnings. And old truths, Marcus added, squeezing Kiera's hand. To family, Kiera said finally. In all its forms. As they sat there, making plans and sharing stories, the city glittered beyond the windows. Somewhere out there, Maria was preparing for tomorrow's reunion. In Boston, a culinary class would be surprised to learn their beloved instructor was leaving for New York. And in the hearts of everyone in that room, a simple truth took root. Sometimes the longest journeys lead us right back home. The next morning would bring its own challenges. There would be press to manage, explanations to give, relationships to navigate. But for now, in this moment, for people who had started as strangers sat together as family, proving that sometimes the strongest bonds are the ones we choose to rebuild. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not the towers Thomas had built, not the programs Kiera had created, not even the years of separation. What mattered was this: the choice to begin again, to forgive, to grow, to love. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Tonight, they simply sat together, sharing the comfortable silence of people who had finally found their way home.